And we are recording. And I'm lucky enough to have with me George Henderson, who is an independent researcher who's published research papers out of the Auckland University of Technology, often alongside one of our previous guests, Professor Grant Schofield. George also has a tremendous blog called Hopeful Geranium, which documents his research on human physiology, stemming from his impressively self-researched diet-induced recovery from hepatitis C, which is, of course, a virus. So welcome and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Ali. Great to be here.
So can you talk us through your understanding and thoughts on coronavirus since the first time you heard about it in China until now?
And straight up I want to say is I'm not a clinician. I have not had experience dealing with this virus. I have just been reading, I've had plenty of time to read the things that people have been sharing, including things that are being shared from the front lines, but I don't have any particular kind of, pet theory about what the virus is doing. I'm just trying to see it in the general world of viruses that we've dealt with through history and the previous contenders. And so we have these a long line of viruses, I suppose, coming out of animals, because that's the place where the only place or the most likely place that they change their form and become some kind of novel pathogen to us. And we go back to the Spanish flu of 1918, and more recently, 1968, you had the Hong Kong flu. This was a new flu virus that killed about 1 million people worldwide, 100,000 people in the United States. I had this, I think, in about 1969 in Invercargill, New Zealand. My whole family had it. It was really horrible. It was like you're kind of like caked in snot and you ache for like a couple of weeks and you can't do anything much. And the SARS and MERS viruses, these were coronaviruses, and SARS coronavirus arose in Hubei province and probably came from a civet, a palm civet, that had acquired a mutant form of the virus. Believed to be, or there's a theory that low selenium levels in Hubei make it a particularly good sort of place for new viruses to arise, because the rate of viral mutation will be higher if there isn't enough selenium to kind of protect the viral genome. And also this sort of harvesting of selenium by the virus, which a lot of RNA viruses use a lot of selenium, and in parts of the world where people are very low in selenium, or where people's diets are very low in selenium, can potentially be more harmful to them. The virus can mutate and be more harmful to other people after that. And I don't think they're seeing, so far they haven't detected COVID mutating in the human population, but it's believed to arise in animal populations under these conditions. So we have the SARS coronavirus probably arising in that way in Hubei, the MERS coronavirus, which I think sort of died off quite early. I think that one was controlled pretty well. And you have more recently the swine flu, which is another flu mutation coming up, and that was about 2009. And so we have another one of these, but it is presenting with something that's like the acute respiratory distress syndrome of SARS, but seems to be different. So people are saying it's different. It's affecting the immune system and lungs differently from how SARS used to. So treating it as SARS isn't, completely perfect all the time. And so yeah, that's where we're at. It seems to be pretty highly contagious, and it seems to have, I think, a relatively high case fatality rate, perhaps because of its unpredictability. And this might go down as clinicians get a handle on it and kind of understand that its own nature, the particular nature of the condition, experience could lower the case fatality rate even before there's a cure.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's something that is really being scrambled for at the moment, is proper data on the case fatality rate and really the denominator of that equation.
Yeah.
So You've looked into the immune response to new viruses. What can you tell about C19 and how we're responding to it?
Well, there was a case study a few days ago, of maybe a couple of weeks ago now, of somebody who had mild course of COVID-19, and it was a kind of a complete following the immune system through the course of the virus, and they found a kind of a normal, broad spectrum response across innate immunity and acquired immunity that led to the acquisition of antibodies and presumably, the mild course of infection. So there you have sort of the healthy young person's immune system that responds to a new pathogen fairly quickly, is aware that there is one. I think that's an important kind of point of the immune response, because that can be missed among all the signals going on, and sorting out which B cells, which antibody producing cells, identifying the right one to replicate and make the best matching antibodies. This is called immunodominance, and it's kind of the point of a vaccine or something is to not only give the body a dose of a dose of the thing, the antigen, the thing we need to make the antibodies to, but also to put it in a state of alertness so it knows to do the sorting process, so it knows to kind of reach for that it's important to find an antibody for this one, because you get a lot of antigens in your body all the time. If you think about all the allergens you're exposed to, if you think about, drugs, your body makes antibodies to drugs, anything that shouldn't be there. You get a splinter in your finger, your body will make antibodies to it. So there's a lot of kind of noise in this system. And when you have a new infection, you need to recognize it as a new infection. You need this kind of like, this one's an important signal going on, to sort through all the antibodies and come up with a quick answer. And this is why, this sort of drops off with age, for example, and it drops off in various forms of ill health, the ability to do this. And so you have, and so I'll cut a long story short, and I'll get to the end here. You find that when you give flu vaccines to elderly, and people in America, I think, sort of qualify for a flu vaccine at 65, and is sort of roughly cut off like this when we're saying elderly. You give a flu vaccine to elderly people, and perhaps only 20 to 30% of them are immune to that flu strain after the vaccine. It's not very good for giving herd immunity in that population, where you'd probably want at least 2/3 of them to be immune. And so to cut a long story short, I found this out when I was looking at probiotic research, because there's been quite a bit of research into probiotics and their effect on immune responses. And when you give elderly people probiotics and you give them the flu vaccine, they are twice as likely, or sometimes 3 times as likely to have, if they're healthy elderly people and you eliminate a few other categories, sometimes 3 times as likely to have the immune response that you want, and what you call seroprotection, meaning that if they get the flu, they'll be protected against it. If they're exposed to it, they'll be protected. And of course, when I read this, I was like, well, this is astounding, 2 or 3-fold increase. This is a massive increase. This is great. But then I went and thought, well, how can you get a 3-fold increase unless you've got a really low immunity rate to start with? That's implying the baseline is quite low. So I went and dug in the individual papers to kind of find what the raw rate of seroconversion and seroprotection, which are different ways of looking at antibody levels after a flu vaccine, are. And I found they were shockingly low, like 20%, like 20-something% is a pretty common result. And I thought, well, no wonder that there's so much debate about whether flu vaccines actually work, because but that shows that the immune response sort of declines with age, and but it also shows it's dependent on a factor that can be restored, which is signaling from the gut in this case.
Yeah, that's the microbiome and immunity absolutely fascinates me. I just as an anecdote, had what I think may have been COVID-19 a couple of weeks ago. I had several of the hallmark symptoms, and including some gut upset. And what happened in the week or 10 days afterwards was that I experienced continued kind of gut problems, like after I ate anything, I would bloat out, and I can't remember that ever happening to me. And that would happen after every meal for several days, and there was continued gut problems. It seemed very unusual. I hadn't changed how I ate, but I also put on weight uh, rapidly, and had a sort of really bad migraine, which is something I used to get a lot. Just these things which point to potentially, the gut. And I wonder why you think probiotics seem to make a difference in the area that you were looking at, and how the gut's really involved here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is really complicated, and there's probably more than one pathway going on. The main one is that the probiotics species, they kind of mimic an infection. So they're I guess, long-standing symbiotic, relationship where we've tolerated something that perhaps used to be a pathogen. So perhaps we still recognize it as a pathogen, that the signals there that are giving that level of alertness and that you want when you're exposed to a new bacteria. It's what's called a new pathogen. It's what's called a adjuvant effect. When you're designing a vaccine, you don't just put in the antigens, you have to put in things that will stimulate the immune system. That's usually aluminium, but it's usually actually a mixture of different things, including aluminium. And you could make adjuvants out of, say, probiotic extracts and so forth. It would be a fancy and expensive way of doing it, but I'm sure there's lots of sort of more natural things that you could make adjuvants out of if you could be bothered. So there's that kind of alert signal coming through. But also perhaps there's changes in the microbiome itself. So you take the probiotic and there's some effect of that particular organism is to suppress some less desirable organism or something like that. And this is probably also a pathway for some herbal medicines that sort of boost immunity in the same way. Is on the one hand, they're mimicking the infection, so to make you more alert, but on the other hand, they're probably also changing the microbiome in other ways. And there's a theory that viruses cycle through intestinal bacteria. That intestinal bacteria play a role in the way that viruses are, presented to the immune system for a start, and perhaps that they're exploiting some bacteria as an infection route as well. And I think an important consideration here is that the gut is a kind of a mucosal domain. They're mucosal cells, and it's the same with the throat and nose and throat and lungs, and that it's kind of this kind of wet outside of the body, kind of inside outside of the body. If you think about the evolution of organisms, so they have an inside. The inside is kind of like the outside, internalized, and it needs this this kind of dampness and this kind of food for microbes to be producing that, which is what mucus is. And so something that stimulates one part of this mucosal domain can have an effect on another seemingly unrelated one, like well, of course the gut is connected to our breathing apparatus through the throat, so there is a connection there.
And I guess the gut in and of itself is several chambers and different systems that sometimes shouldn't interact but often do when things go wrong. And
like appendicitis, a classic example of that.
Yeah. And you fired shots at a certain subsection of the scientific community, understandably, I think, for dismissing certain measures in various diseases, but particularly thinking about supplements and herbs in relation to COVID-19. So what are your thoughts on this subject?
Yes, I think you can be too dismissive of something just because the evidence on it isn't perfect. But it's still, if you go and look at the science around something like, say, echinacea, you find heaps of really well designed experiments in animals that are, you can certainly question their relevance to human experiments. But then when you see a human experiment and it has certain results, you can go, well, actually, there's hundreds of papers in animals, or there's a lot of research in animals that we can look to see if that's plausible. It's not just someone just making up some idea and kind of cherry picking a few references and putting out a review paper or something. There's been people testing this stuff for years. There's been people testing it for years, and they've designed the most rigorous experiments they can to test the effects that they want to test, and so on. So there are bodies of science there, and then it's also a question of course, in a crisis, you have to ask, well, what else do you have? Do you have anything? You have a vaccine in 2021? Oh, great. Oh, well, let's just ignore everything else until then. That's not sustainable. But on the other hand, you have the question of, well, this is a novel situation, and anything that looks good in another situation may not look good in this situation. So you really have to kind of, obviously be careful. But I would think at the present point of time, there are a heck of a lot of people out there who are going to be taking elderberry when they get a sniffle and think it might be COVID. There are people who are going to be taking lots of vitamin C when they get a sniffle and think it might be COVID. It would certainly be good to pay attention to what's happening to these people. I'm not hearing any scare stories about them yet anyway. I approached this line of research from the point of view that when I had the swine flu, I'd read a bit of research about elderberry, and it had impressed me. And so when I got the swine flu, I went and got some Sambucus, and I took it right away as soon as I started to feel ill. And I gave it to my son, who had also started to feel ill. Now, my daughter and my partner had had the swine flu for a couple of days before us, and I hadn't been at home, and I hadn't got the elderberry to them within 48 hours. And my son and I were able to take it within 24 hours. Now, we were sick but healthy. We were able to go and help the other two. We were able to kind of carry things for the next week while they were still stayed extremely ill. There was a clear contrast between the two people who got elderberry early and the two people who didn't. Now, I do think that elderberry is possibly more specific for flus than for other types of viruses. Certainly, the best evidence for it is in flu. But then, flu was the most serious virus until recently, pretty much. And so that made me think, well, I kind of know in myself that it works, but can I prove it? Can I kind of find evidence? And yeah, there are trials, but they only add up to like 118 people, I think. Good results, like basically a halving of the flu infection rate, which is consistent with the probiotic hypothesis, because if you take something like that in the first phase of an infection, you're raising your cytokine levels through, I'm not really sure what the pathway of the elderberry is, but you get this rise of interferon, natural killer cells, and in cytokines in general. That's just making the response more kind of rapid, more kind of aware, and you're more likely to go into that seroconversion and get the antibodies out of that. But as I looked at that, and I thought, well, yeah, I mean, this backs up what I think, but it's slim. There's only 118 people, there's only 4 trials and so forth. I kept noticing things that would pop up in the sidebar. And so one of those is BCG vaccine. So the old TB vaccine is countries where that's been used have seem to have lower mortality rates from COVID. And they're doing a trial where they're going to give it to some healthcare workers and see if it prevents them getting sick. So
yeah, 2 notable countries who haven't had the BCG is Italy and the United States, right?
Yes, and I think countries like Germany, where you've got the low mortality rate, have had it, and so forth.
UK
so you've got that, you've got that between country correlation. Of course, when you compare countries, as Ansel Keys will tell you, there's a lot of other stuff going on. So it's just sort of the beginning of the trail of evidence. But then I see the BCG, and I see, well, probiotics are turning up. And so I went and looked at the probiotic evidence, and that's more compelling because you've got, I mean, not that the herbal evidence isn't compelling, but the bulk, the size of the probiotic evidence is greater. So you've got more than 1,000 people in trials with a pretty much have rate of upper respiratory tract infections in people taking probiotics, but you've also got a fairly sizable body of evidence about giving probiotics before vaccines. As I mentioned earlier with the flu vaccine, that shows these double seroconversion rates in healthy elderly. So you don't see an improvement in younger people, healthy adults, because they've got overall pretty good seroconversion rates anyway. But you do have these improvements in the healthy elderly, and then you don't see them in the sort of hospitalized elderly. Again, because perhaps they're too far gone for the probiotics to help that much. But definitely in the group, a very important group, I think, of healthy elderly people who want to stay healthy, because they're not going to stay healthy if they get the flu and they don't have the seroconversion. In that group, you have the big differences. So you have this more rigorous testing, which is testing the effect of a vaccine, where you've got a lab. It's not self-reported. Did you get a sniffle or not? It's like it's what are your antibody levels? What are have you got antibodies to the thing we've tried to give you antibodies to? So it's a very rigorous test. You're getting lab results, and I always trust lab markers way over anything that's self-reported. And and you're seeing these effects which are consistent in both direction and size with the effects from the RCTs. So I think you can have confidence in that effect, and by extension you can have confidence in anything that's going down the same path, like the BCG or the herbal extracts that have been tested in this context. By analogy, they all kind of fit together. It's all this thing of kind of immune alertness and kind of waking up an immune system that's been, perhaps to some extent doped by modern lifestyle and modern diet, because there are things that will kill off the good bacteria that the type of bacteria that you might give someone in one of these probiotics can be killed off by diet high in linoleic acid, by a diet high in unsaturated fats, because probiotic bacteria do not really like unsaturated fats. And this should be obvious to anyone that's made yogurt. There's only two things you can make yogurt with. One is dairy and the other is coconut. And dairy is the most saturated animal fat in nature, and coconut's the most saturated plant fat. So bacteria are trying to tell us something there. They don't like this highly unsaturated oil mix, and also they don't like carbohydrate that's had all the fiber stripped from it. Obviously, this is so if you've got your flour and sugar and oil is not going to promote the type of biome that is associated with the kind of good immune response. And if we go back to the probiotic vaccine research, you are getting seroconversion in like a third of the people. You even without the probiotics, it's about a third of the people who've got still got whatever it takes. And so presumably, if you looked at that in some kind of nutritional epidemiology way, you'd find those people had more fiber, more dairy, less processed food, and perhaps were just eating better anyway, because nutrition overall is an important part of this too. And if you're depleted in zinc, selenium, and vitamin A and so forth, you may not be able to raise a proper immune response either that easily.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, and I think there's the area of the scientific community that you were targeting, probably guilty sometimes of minimizing the positive effects that nutrition can have on the kind of defenses that our bodies need to fend off basic attacks and chronic illness.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, this has been studied. There are people, devoting their lives to researching, say, the effect of malnutrition on a vaccine response, or the effect of one or another supplement on a vaccine response. And one of the other things that looks good, and this is quite curious, is vitamin E. So high dose vitamin E supplements around vaccines. And I don't pretend to understand how that works, but that's an interesting one either. But you get people poo-pooing this stuff because someone like Dr. Oz says it, so he's a class enemy. He has to be attacked regardless of whether he's right or wrong. And you get people sort of pooing this stuff, and then it becomes obvious they haven't read this research. They don't know that people have actually researched this. This is a field, it's a field in immunology. It's a field in vaccine research. It's in the journals. It's in the journals. People have devoted their lives to studying this stuff, and here's people who are just automatically assuming that it's witchcraft. And yeah, there's a lot of that goes on, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's disappointing. I think the sort of the lack of time that we have and headspace ends up us needing shorthands, and we jump to conclusions. The area of supplements is something that really interests me. I mean, I think, to summarize, what I think is going on there is you have supplementation available in various forms and strengths and qualities, and they are the same molecules a lot of the time as our bodies need and use. And
And if they're slightly different, then they often have different effects that tell us something
yes,
about
indeed.
that too.
But I mean, if we've got these isolated molecules which are at least very similar, if not identical, to the ones that our bodies need, it stands to reason that if we can ingest them meaningfully, that they would have a meaningful effect. Now, you get so much sort of knee-jerk kind of rejection of the idea that they could help. But I think partly because it's an unregulated market where you end up with charlatans or well-meaning people who don't understand what they're selling these things to people at the wrong dose, in the wrong form, of the wrong quality. And then, of course, you're going to see reduced benefits or no benefits or harm if they're not applied properly and in the right dosage and the right form. But that doesn't mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. It means we should redouble our efforts to work out which ones work best and when.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, if you look at the history of drug research, you have some, you know, they used to give, before they invented, paracetamol, which I don't think is a great drug, but there used to be an analog of paracetamol, was it acetanilide, and it used to kill people. And, it's the same drug we use today, just needed a little modification, but it went on for like decades, so of it actually killing people and being promoted by people who had no real idea what it did. And you saw the same thing with heroin, being marketed as a non-addictive drug, and then that history repeated itself quite recently with the opioids, and yeah, so it's not this tendency for things to escape from regulation or to be like that outside of regulation is not unique to things that are outside the medical model necessarily. But one of the things I think this issue of the issue of standardization is an important one, because to market a drug, you've got to have an isolated molecule, pretty much, with a few exceptions. And you may not want to isolate the molecule if you're, say you're looking at probiotics. You may want quite a broad range of different things to be available. You may not want to just narrow it down to one and say, oh, well, this one, we think this one's the best. We're going to drop all the others, not stop researching those, and push this one, find the $1 billion it'll take to bring this one to market, as a drug. You may not want to do that. Like, for example, with cannabis, that's an effective drug. That certainly is an effective psychotropic drug, but most people who use it wouldn't want it to be standardized. They'd want to keep getting the bespoke combination of ingredients that they've found through their lives. And yet that's not a placebo. Cannabis isn't a placebo. It has a strong effect. And so I think there's kind of a time and a place for that kind of approach. And perhaps not everything exists in quite that realm. But I think but still, to prove anything, you have to isolate variables. You have to have enough work that isolates variables so you can back up the claims you're making for things that are a bit looser, perhaps.
That makes sense. I mean, I don't think there's any miracle supplements, is what I would suggest, in that most people get the most gains from changing their nutrition. And then if there's any if there's any areas where they've really fallen far behind, but you hear about people needing, elephant doses of vitamin B12, for example, or other B vitamins, or other vitamins that they might be frankly deficient in, to climb out of a kind of metabolic hole that they found themselves in after years and years, where they're in a kind of deep potential well, and they need to. It's not like they just can take normal amounts and get themselves out. They need to leap out. But that is an area that's so understudied and poorly understood, that was why you've got this sea of people self-experimenting.
Yeah, I mean, the supplement can tell you what direction you need to go in, but I wouldn't like to sustain that direction for a lifetime just by taking a supplement. In my own case, I really got my start in this whole field by taking supplements, because I had Hep C. I read the books on Hep C, and there was suggestion that supplements were beneficial, and there was a bit of research, and so I thought, I'll try these. I'll take these supplements. Took them and felt much better, and relatively quickly, within a couple of weeks, started to feel like, I've got a handle on this. Now I can actually make myself feel good. And it took me a couple of years, and I was mostly using supplements before I realized that I could achieve most of these aims by changing my diet. And then I didn't need the supplements anymore, but it really pointed me in the right direction. It really said, well, oxidative stress is an issue for you, insulin resistance is an issue for you, these kind of things. It kind of clearly highlighted these areas that then, when I was looking at general diet, I could recognize that because I'd taken high dose of N-acetylcysteine and it had made me feel freedom from symptoms, that therefore a diet that took me in the same direction that would, for example, would potentially have the same benefits, because a whole bunch of stuff that's supposed to improve insulin sensitivity had some benefit for me, but therefore just eating less carbs would have the same benefit, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to me. I was looking for something I could add, and Georgia Eade's spoken about this eloquently, that there's a real desire in humans to add a magic bullet to what they're doing to solve everything. So whether that's a superfood like goji berries, or whether it's a pill from the doctor, the idea of removing things is much harder to get your head around at first.
Yeah.
And so we've sort of covered it, talking about your history there with Hep C, but what might be the elephant in the room for COVID is this potential metabolic risk factor, which is definitely correlated with viral disease, death, in other respects. So what do you think the situation is with COVID-19 and things like diabetes and so on, and what do you think we should be doing going ahead?
Well, I think the risk is so kind of obviously stacked against people with metabolic disease that reversing those symptoms of metabolic disease, which we know we can do in most cases fairly rapidly, is something that has to be protective. How protective, we'll find out. But if you get people out of those categories, if you get their blood glucose down, if you especially get their breathing, because apnea is one of the is one of the kind of early targets of, say, a low carb intervention, or fasting, or one of these interventions is improvement in breathing is kind of by the respiratory quotient, and by the reduction of fat on the tongue, and reduction of perhaps factors that are constricting the airways, and as well as the immune tone, all sorts of things that you would predict would be beneficial. Just getting people out of those categories where they're at most risk of illness, and taking them off drugs that might be dangerous in this context, because the people who are going to do best, for whatever reason, are the people who become infected and who are not dependent on multiple medications, because there's a whole lot of other factors that the doctor has to worry about. Do I increase this, decrease that? There's all sorts of things that your doctor's not going to have to worry about if you're not already medicated. And you can do this, with diet and supplements to a great extent. And one of the things I'm thinking about here is that it does not look good to be taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or be taking paracetamol, because these are things that reduce the response to vaccines. So as well as there being a list of things that will enhance the response to vaccines as adjuvants, there are also things that will decrease the response to vaccines. And paracetamol is definitely one of those. So you have lower antibody levels, and you'll have lower, if you need to take these things, you're potentially at higher risk, and also not good in animal models of pneumonia. In a way, these drugs aren't good. So if you can manage pain, manage headache or whatever in some other way, I think you're dodging a small bullet there.
And then obviously the usual advice about removing sugar, veg oil, and flour, refined flour.
Yes. I think those are the basic ones. Anyone who does those things is going to feel better.
It's funny, like there's an understandable kind of voice, collective voice that's trying to keep the bandwidth clear about messaging on what to do around COVID-19. And that particular group of people has been kind of vocal about saying, stop telling people to cut out custard creams when they're, isolated for weeks on end. They should be focusing on washing their hands and staying isolated and staying happy. But I don't see why you can't have, an added bonus bit of advice which might actually help people thrown in there.
Well, why not enjoy a steak or something? Why does it have to be a custard cream? Why is it? But I understand. Well, I don't really, because it's sort of so long ago and so far away, and the stuff did me so much harm. But I kind of understand people's emotional attachment to food, especially in a family setting, because like sharing food can be an important family bonding thing, and cooking is often something family members are good at, and baking is something people are good at, and people want to be able to contribute with the thing that they're good at. So I certainly understand this in the kind of the sociological value of it. I just wonder if people can't give these, perhaps people could give this advice about the custard cream or whatever in a context where they also told people all the other right things to do. Okay, so you can enjoy this because you haven't eaten shit all day, so now your kid cooks one of these, yes, you can enjoy it. Perhaps that might be a more kind of nuanced way of putting that message there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But to just say this thing's valuable and don't give it up now is I don't think that's helpful.
No, me neither. So
because we may be in our bubbles now, and we are going to come out of them one day, and COVID is still going to be there. I mean, this is the thing. So if you look at, say, the probiotic experiments, it took several weeks of supplementation to get the best results. It took, it's like 2 or 3 months at least, and but we actually have that time. We most people will have that time. So certainly in my country, New Zealand, we may have beaten it altogether, may be able to get it down to nothing in a month, but it's if not, it's still around, and it's going to be infecting people actually very slowly over the next couple of years. So you actually do have time to be in a better state. And if you are seriously metabolically challenged, the risks are huge for you if you do get it. So it's a very valuable investment for people investing in their health through diet and exercise at the moment. It's a very valuable investment for some people, and it certainly shouldn't be discouraged.
I agree completely. It'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. I agree that there's going to be this continued risk. There's nobody who I've spoken to or read who has been able to rule out the idea that this will just become a seasonal thing, that it could mutate, and instead of the flu season being the really big worry, it could be that flu plus COVID season becomes the new sort of joint risk every cold season. But I mean, the same thing holds true for COVID as flu, is that people who have compromised immune systems, compromised metabolic systems do worse.
Yes. Yes, and the numbers of fatalities in these categories are greater than the numbers for people with compromised immune systems at the moment. And that may be just because the compromised immune disease is relatively rare, but the amount of death that you can chalk up just to the metabolic syndrome and its ramifications is enormous. It's most of the toll that I can see.
Yeah, and of course the bald fact that 13.7 approximately million people every year die from coronary vascular disease. So, I hope that the tone of conversation around prevention of unnecessary death looks at the huge figures there, as well as the important specific viral response.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's something that I think fascinates me about this outbreak is there's a kind of ghoulish, glued nature to the death toll, and if we looked at the rolling death count from car accidents or coronary vascular disease, then we would be equally horrified. And I know the nature of an unknown novel viral pathogen is different because we don't know how to deal with it properly yet, and it's scary because of that. But if you look at the raw numbers, then they should scare you just as much for these other diseases.
And people are highlighting, well, TB is still killing. TB is a treatable disease that has gone on killing people and is still killing more people than COVID, or was at the last count. And this is treatable. There are drugs for this. There's nutrition has an effect on it, and so forth. We think of it as a 100-year-old disease, something we wiped out, but it's certainly not. And maybe everything will look a bit different to us after this, but. Metabolic disease takes a huge toll. Diabetes takes a huge toll normally, and and also a huge toll in kind of shortening, the fun part of people's lives, which it's there's life expectancy and then there's health expectancy, and most people would rather have probably rather have 80 years of being fit and going about and feeling reasonably happy than a period from say 50 to 110 feeling miserable and sick and in pain, and that's really kind of the difference that the sugar, oil and flour are making. to people, or the kind of the conveniences of storable foods that came along at some point, and people were like, yeah, we can eat this lower quality food, we don't feel as good, but we're sometimes able to get extra of it that we can store away for a year when there's no food at all, and that keeps us alive. And that's really the trade-off that people have made with these foods. Going back at the start of the Neolithic Revolution, that was really the appeal, because why would people do this? Why would people eat this stuff? If you think, why would people turn to eating wheat or turn to eating corn? And the reason is that you can actually store it for a couple of years, and nothing that people ate before that could be stored that long, could be put into a dry form and stored that long. And that's going to be a lifesaver for some community at some time over history.
Absolutely, and allows you to feed more people and plan and trade for bigger wealth and raise armies and conquer. And
and build cathedrals and so forth.
I love all that stuff. That's kind of the reason that I call my business Paleo Canteen, is really the logic of paleo rather than the dogma of the diet itself. Which I think is good logic, that we should emulate to a reasonable extent the conditions under which our bodies evolved.
That's it. We evolved within certain parameters. We evolved to deal with certain things quite well, and then there were other things that we didn't have to think about. We didn't have to evolving. We didn't have to think about large amounts of carbohydrate freed from their fiber and other sort of conditions. We didn't have to think about concentrated linoleic acid. A few things that were relatively rare in the past have kind of swamped us, and lots of things that were common in the past have more or less disappeared, and including bacteria as well as and other kind of symbionts and pathogens, as well as items of food. And so here we are, and backtracking on this trend produces results. It produces quite remarkable results. So
and circling back round to supplements, because it's an area that I've kind of done a bit of experimentation in myself, and it's mainly from reading other people's accounts of how they've done. There's a particular set of there's a particular forum called Phoenix Rising. I don't know if you've ever been on those ones.
Yes, it's a chronic fatigue site.
And
that was an early part of my reading, because it kind of tied in with a lot of what I was reading about hepatitis as well.
And really, some of the people there are in a desperate state and have been for years, and are trying stuff that, to a casual observer like I was, just seemed, beyond the pale, really maybe even dangerous. And but I mean, these are people who have been failed profoundly by their doctors, because the doctors don't have any understanding or training in what might be done. And in truth, neither do the patients, and they're just having an educated stab in the dark almost. And I kind of tried various things that some felt maybe feel better, some made me feel nothing, and some maybe had deleterious effects that made me stop it. But I wish there was a better source out there that could say, within these parameters, for this, that, or the other thing, you should try this, that, or the other thing in these doses from this manufacturer, And I don't know if there is something like that. Do you know if there is?
Well, I know for I know for Hep C that by the time I got on to looking at this in about 2003, there was a book called The Hepatitis C Handbook by John Dolan, and that had a summary of supplement research on Hep C that I found really useful, and that took me, this was my starting point. So I think this can be done for something like Hep C. It's a little bit more complicated with chronic fatigue because you have more interplay with genetic variation. You have more interplay with the NTHR allele, variation. 1-methylation variations is, I think, a big part of the Phoenix Rising protocols, and these, vary widely between people. So, so that sort of thing complicates things. As soon as people have to consider their own genome, things become a lot more complicated. And I prefer things where you don't have to.
Yeah, and I suppose diet's one of those that there's not really a genetic variant that I can think of that should prevent you from removing veg oils, sugar, and flour from your diet.
No, definitely not. There are certainly genomes that will predict you'll get more benefit from, say, removing seed oil. There are things that influence the rate at which you produce arachidonic acid from linoleic acid, and how much it interferes with your omega-3 metabolism and things like that. But in general, I think, for one thing, the amount of excess at the moment is so great that no one's going to need that much, because no one ever had that much before.
Yeah. Something that I kind of hem and haw about sometimes is wondering whether I am lucky or not that I'm a bit of an autoimmune disaster zone, because it means that I really shouldn't ever eat things like pizza or bread again, or whether I'm better to be someone like, I don't know, Paul Hollywood, who's on the Bake Off show over here, who obviously tolerates it up to a point. I mean, he's kind of carrying a bit of extra weight, but that could be a few things. But he's obviously not like got alopecia or vitiligo, or his esophagus is closing, or like mine did, or doesn't have sarcoidosis, risking his eyesight and all that. So maybe it's a good thing that some people have severe reactions, and then if they get the knowledge, they can fix it young, because I think most of the time people get to 50 or 60 and the death by 1,000 cuts happens.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really good point, and I've thought about this myself too. Is would it be better to, the kind of person who can eat sugar or can eat bread and seems to be metabolically healthy, is metabolically healthy and isn't noticing the kind of things that I notice about these foods? Will it be better to be that person, or is it going to catch up with them overall? I mean, I don't really have an answer for that. And I think one of the things, because, is our immune response to these foods one of the things that's doing the damage? And, we have to cut it out for that reason. On top of the kind of potential metabolic effects, is the immune response magnifying the metabolic effects? All these kind of questions. But it's interesting, if we come back to the COVID story for a second here. One of the things that I've always found about viral infections like colds and flus, respiratory infections, is that when I have these, I am far less tolerant of things that I normally have marginal tolerance of. Like dairy is the perfect example, and I know a lot of people think this, and a lot of people also claim to have debunked it and so forth. But I'm one of these people. If I'm a little bit allergic to dairy, it makes me sniffle, but I eat it because I think it's a valuable food and I like it. But if I get a cold, I instantly notice that the dairy is going to make it worse. And it's the same with other things. Traces of various vegetable proteins that I normally tolerate in my food, I notice them. So something like peanut butter that I can eat most days, if I have peanut butter when I've got a cold, it's going to make it worse. And this sort of thing, which could be, one of these examples of the virus interfering with the gut bacteria. It could be that could be the pathway for that, or just a different immune state. But I mean, that's one of the things that I notice is that when I get a respiratory infection, it tells me to be more strict about the foods I'm eating.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I've got hope that people will come out the other end wanting answers about how they can protect themselves, and look to really improving their health. And I'll be there to help them if they want that. What's your hope from all this?
Yes, I mean, I especially hope that it kind of puts the focus back on all-cause mortality when we're doing, you know, health epidemiology or whatever, that people remember, well, hey, there is actually another way to die. You know, it's not all about heart disease. It never was all about heart disease. And, you know, lowering rates of heart disease by increasing rates of diabetes and obesity are probably, you know, counterproductive. It's kind of an own goal. And we need to be looking at interventions that reduce risk across the board, which, you know, there are, you know, I mean, this is obviously doable, that you could reduce the rate, that one intervention should be able to reduce the rate of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. I mean, obviously, because these all have strong metabolic risk factors. So, you know, the single-minded focus on LDL as cholesterol is the only worthwhile metabolic risk factor is really what has got us into the state of having kind of metabolic disease promoting diets being promoted by health agencies, which is basically the situation we're in at the moment. It has really resulted on the single-minded focus on LDL as the only measure that's going to make a difference to your life expectancy, which is, you know, just ridiculous.
Yeah, and I can see it already from some of the big players in the food industry, like Arla have recently put out a big yogurt campaign in the UK about their low sugar yogurt. So I think finally the demon, because I think the public wants more or less a single demon, and I think it's finally come round to being sugar.
Yeah, and sugar's a good one. I mean, it kind of, beyond the harm that sugar itself can do, it's kind of associates with other things such as, you know, artificial colours and flavourings, or just generally the absence of nutrition, and, you know, all kinds of, you know, it tends to be used to make bad foods taste better rather than good foods taste better, and, you know, that kind of thing. And so it yeah, I think it's probably got more reach than most single enemy things.
And then maybe after that, who knows, it'll come around to veg oil. But, you know, one day at a time, sweet Jesus, as they say.
Yeah, but even veg oil, like, you definitely see the difference here. So in the 1990s, rice bran oil and canola oil became available, and, you know, I know that, you know, they may seem satanic to us, but these foods have greatly reduced linoleic acid content, and that was a deliberate choice of the food industry to go for promote foods with lower linoleic acid content. And, you know, it's a classic strategy in marketing, is if you want to have a product, and sell it, find something wrong with your competitor's product, find something wrong with the existing product. You know, no one was interested in electric cars until they found something wrong with petrol, which was global warming. You know, so you find something wrong with a competitor's product, and you can sell a product that, you know, may even be inferior to it if you find enough wrong with it. And this is what happened to butter in the past. And but it's been happening to linoleic acid for a while. But and so you get peanut butter in New Zealand is overwhelmingly being shifted. Brands are shifting to high LDL peanuts to get linoleic acid content down. So this is happening, and fast food manufacturers are using more palm oil and canola, you know, to these palm and canola blends that are, you know, a great deal better than, say, corn oil or soybean oil would have been. And so we see this shift, which sort of no one has admitted they're doing it. No one has openly admitted that they're doing this thing, but the rationale of it is to get the omega-6 down. But it seems to be kind of the wrong way about it, because we can improve the omega-6 omega-3 ratio in food in the body by eating more saturated fat, is kind of the finding, the novel finding that I've come across more recently. And now, for example, when aquaculturists are farming fish, the sort of target is to have as much omega-3 in the muscle as possible, to have a DHA level in the muscle of, say, the salmon or the trout that's equivalent to what, as close as possible as to what it would be in the wild. And they've been trying different types of feed for this. And of course, they would have started off with fish oil and fish meal, but that's hardly sustainable, feeding fish on fish at the amount, feeding fish at the amounts that they want. So they've been trying various vegetable-based foods and found that the type of vegetable fat that gives farmed fish the highest DHA content happens to be palm oil, which is actually very low in polyunsaturated fat, has a good omega-3/6 ratio, and is high in saturated fat. And the finding is that the saturated fat, sort of protects the omega-3 and gets it out to the body, whereas having an oil higher in omega-6 or even higher in oleic acid decreases the amount of omega-3 that gets through. And so, well, this is fascinating, but as fish, does it relate to humans? Well, what I've found is that, we are evolved from fish ultimately, and this mechanism, because it allows mammals to conserve a rare nutrient, it allows mammals to make better use of a rare but very valuable nutrient, which is omega-3 fatty acids, that it seems to have been conserved all the way down from the fish to us. So you have rodent studies where by feeding rodents dairy fat, usually you can get higher omega-3 levels than if you feed them, say, say soy oil, which has got some omega-3 in it, or canola oil, things like that. So you find that dairy or having dairy in the diet is optimal for putting omega-3 into the bloodstream, even though the dairy is low in omega-3 itself. The type of saturated fats in dairy have a sparing effect on omega-3. So and the omega-6 has the opposite effect. And there's 4 studies in humans where there are 2 studies from France where they're in a monastery setting. They are feeding 2 different types of diet, and one has butter and canola oil, and the other one has something like corn and canola oil, and finding that you get much higher omega-3 levels when you're feeding the butter along with the canola oil, and that was mainly for DHA in that study. Now, interestingly, they found they didn't get the same effect when they artificially boosted the saturated fat content of the butter by adding crystallized myristic acid to it. So kind of, I'm not sure if that would apply if you were just eating more butter, if they just increased. I'd like to see one where they just had more butter and didn't try and do it that way. But you're getting these good increases. And then there's another one, so there's 2 of these, two studies like that. There's one where they're feeding infants on a dairy fat and plant fat mix versus a plant fat mix, and they're finding that the dairy fat and plant fat mix gets a DHA level comparable to breast milk or comparable to a DHA supplemented diet. Again, that's much better than the seed oil diet. And then there's an experiment from Australia where they gave people fish oil. This is quite an important one because we really want to know, what is the fate of fish oil when you tell people to take it. And they gave people fish oil on the one hand with an omega-6 diet, and on the other hand with a diet of a bit of extra butter and a bit of extra chocolate, and for the saturated fat, and they found a doubled level of EPA in the cholesterol esters and higher EPA in red blood cells. And this is a very significant increase in EPA, and an increase in the omega-3 index, which is a very good marker of health and a predictor of cardiovascular disease, coronary calcium, and things like that. And in that case, also there was a rise in LDL cholesterol. So the LDL cholesterol went up because of the saturated fat, but that effect put more EPA onto it. Now, the only nutrient, as far as I know, that is approved as a drug by the FDA is Vascepa, which is an EPA ester, I think, something that puts EPA into your bloodstream, gets it past the normal thing where it's broken down by the liver and actually gets it into your bloodstream, and it seems to have a similar effect to what feeding the fish oil with butter or with saturated fat would have had. So we've only got these 4 studies in humans. The mechanism does seem to be conserved all the way from the fish, and if you have, you know, butter with your fish, you're getting more fish oil out of it. In your blood, you're getting more of the fish oil appearing in your blood where you want it to be and where it is associated with lower cardiovascular disease. Now, of course, if you only do your nutritional epidemiology comparisons using substitution, you know, we replace this with that, you know, in our model, not in real life, but in our model, we replace this with that. You're never going to see these combined effects of foods that you can see in an experiment, you know, when you say what happens if we combine butter and fish oil. Well, combining butter and fish oil looks like a good idea. And so I think now we can start to explain what went wrong with the whole seed oil theory. By looking at the you know, the fate of omega-3 in the body.
Fascinating stuff, and good to know that I've got a good nutritional reason beyond just the amazing flavour of having butter with my mackerel.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you taking the time today, and maybe you could tell people where they can find you online.
Oh yes, you can find me online at I guess on Twitter, Pudleg, Puddleg, and you can also find me. I work with Grant Schofield for a business called Precure, and we have online courses where we training health coaches, but also just giving people, if somebody just wants a background in nutrition or the use of the ketogenic diet or these kind of areas, there are also courses that are sort of matched to those things. And that's Precure, capital P-R-E, capital K-U-R-E. And we also do run free courses from time to time so people can try various sort of lifestyle approaches. So yeah, check that out.
Brilliant. I'll put that in the show notes. Fantastic. Well, take care and stay safe amidst all the COVID stuff. And I really appreciate you coming on again.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. Thank you very much. Nice speaking to you.